Dawn breaks cold and wet over a muddy field between two small villages you have probably never heard of, Agincourt and Tramecourt. This is northern France, October 25th, 1415. The rain has been falling for days, turning the recently ploughed farmland into a quagmire of thick, clinging mud. The kind of mud that sucks at your boots with every step, that spatters your legs with every movement, that makes even standing still an exhausting effort. On one side of this field, stretching across the narrow space between two woods, stands an English army, perhaps 6,000 men, maybe a few more, maybe a few less. The exact number is lost to history, but what we know is that they are exhausted, hungry, sick, and very far from home. They have been marching for weeks through hostile territory, pursued by a French army that outnumbers them perhaps 3-1, perhaps 4-1, perhaps even 5-1, depending on which source you believe. They are trapped now, their backs to the woods, their path to the port of Calais blocked by the greatest concentration of French military power assembled in a generation. On the other side of that field stands the flower of French chivalry, thousands of armoured knights, the best warriors in Europe, mounted on powerful destriers bred for war. Behind them, thousands more men-at-arms, crossbowmen, foot soldiers, nobles from every corner of France who have gathered here for the honour of destroying this impudent English king who dared to invade their homeland. The French can see the English across the field, a thin line of weary men, and they are confident. Victory seems not just likely, but inevitable. The English are trapped, the English are outnumbered, the English have nowhere to run. By the end of the day, this little army will be destroyed, its king will be captured or killed, and France will have avenged the humiliations of the past decades. That is what the French nobles believe as they stand in their gleaming armour, as they adjust their lances and check their horses, as they prepare to charge across the muddy field and sweep the English away. But that is not what happens. By the time the sun sets on October 25th, thousands of French noblemen will lie dead in the mud, suffocated by their own armour, trampled by their own horses, cut down by arrows fired by men they considered beneath their notice. The English, against all odds, will win one of the most stunning victories in military history. A victory so improbable, so complete, so devastating to French power, that it will echo through centuries, inspiring plays and poems and legends. This is the Battle of Agincourt, a moment when the old medieval order of warfare, the dominance of the armoured knight, the supremacy of noble blood over common birth, was challenged and found wanting. This is the story of how a young English king gambling everything on one campaign transformed himself into a legend. This is the story of English longbowmen turning a muddy field into a killing ground. This is the story of French pride meeting English desperation, and desperation winning. But before we walk onto that field, before we hear the snap of bowstrings and the screams of dying horses, before we watch men drown in mud while wearing a fortune in armour, we need to understand how England and France arrived at this point. We need to understand the 100 Years' War, that long, bitter conflict that had been tearing at both kingdoms for decades. We need to understand Henry V, this young king who would become one of England's greatest military heroes. We need to understand the complex web of dynastic claims, territorial disputes, political ambitions, and personal vendettas that brought these two armies to this field. And we need to understand what medieval warfare actually looked like, how knights fought, how longbows worked, how armies moved and fed themselves, because without that context, the battle itself becomes just a list of actions rather than a human drama played out in mud and blood. Let us step back then to the beginning of this story. Let us trace the path that led an English army deep into France in the autumn of 1415. Let us meet the men who would fight and die at Agincourt, both the great nobles whose names are recorded in chronicles and the common soldiers whose names are lost, but whose actions changed history. This is the story of the Battle of Agincourt, and it begins not on that October morning, but decades earlier in the halls of palaces and the minds of kings who dreamed of empire. The 100 Years' War, despite its name, did not last exactly 100 years. It lasted 116 years, from 1337 to 1453, but the name has stuck. This was not a continuous war in the modern sense of armies constantly in the field, year after year. Rather, it was a series of campaigns, punctuated by truces and treaties, that sometimes lasted for years, followed by renewed outbreaks of fighting. The war was fundamentally about two things. First, the English king's claim to the French throne, a claim based on complex genealogical arguments that we will examine shortly. And second, English control over territories in France, particularly in the southwest, territories that English kings had held since the 12th century, and which they were determined to keep or expand despite French efforts to pry them away. The roots of the conflict go back to 1066, when William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, invaded England and became its king. For the next several centuries, English kings were also Norman nobles, holding lands in France while ruling England. This created a bizarre situation where the King of England was technically a vassal of the King of France for his French territories, even though he was a king in his own right. As English kings married French princesses and acquired more French lands through inheritance and conquest, particularly vast territories in Aquitaine and Gascony in southwestern France, the relationship grew increasingly strained. The French kings naturally wanted to consolidate their control over all of France. The English kings naturally wanted to keep their profitable French possessions and, when opportunity arose, expand them. The spark that ignited the 100 Years' War came in 1337, when King Edward III of England formally claimed the throne of France. His claim was based on the fact that his mother, Isabella, was the daughter of King Philip IV of France. When Philip's line died out through his sons, with no male heirs surviving, Edward argued that he, as Philip's grandson through the female line, had the best claim to the French throne. The French nobility rejected this argument, pointing to Salic law, an ancient Frankish legal tradition that supposedly prohibited inheritance through the female line. They crowned Philip of Valois, a cousin of the dead king, as Philip VI, founding the Valois dynasty. Edward refused to accept this, and the stage was set for over a century of intermittent warfare. The early decades of the war went remarkably well for England. Edward III was a capable military commander, and he led English armies to stunning victories at Crécy in 1346 and at Poitiers in 1356, where his son, the Black Prince, actually captured the French king, John II. These victories were won using tactics that would later be refined at Agincourt, the combination of dismounted men-at-arms holding a defensive position while longbowmen rained arrows on French cavalry charges. The French, wedded to the traditions of chivalric warfare, kept charging into these arrow storms, and they kept losing. By 1360, the Treaty of Bretigny gave England control over a huge swathe of southwestern France, and Edward gave up his claim to the French throne in exchange. It seemed as if England had won. But wars are not decided by single treaties, and by the 1370s, fighting had resumed. This time, the French were more careful. They avoided pitched battles and used a strategy of attrition, nibbling away at English-held territories, raiding English positions, starving out garrisons, slowly reversing the English gains. By 1380, England held little more in France than the port of Calais in the north and a small strip of the Gascon coast in the southwest. The pendulum had swung back. For the next few decades, a series of truces kept the war in abeyance, while both kingdoms dealt with internal problems. England descended into political crisis during the reign of Richard II, who was eventually deposed in 1399 by his cousin, who became Henry IV. France, meanwhile, suffered under the intermittent madness of King Charles VI, whose mental illness created a power vacuum filled by feuding noble factions. The war did not end, but it cooled, with neither side having the will or resources to push for decisive victory. This was the situation when Henry V became King of England in 1413. Henry was 26 years old, young by medieval standards for a king, but he was no untested youth. He had been fighting in wars since his teenage years, campaigning in Wales against rebels, learning the hard lessons of military command in the hills and forests of the Welsh marches. He had also served on his father's council, gaining experience in government and politics. By the time he inherited the throne, Henry was a fully formed leader, intelligent, pious, determined, and utterly convinced of his own righteousness. He was also convinced that he had a legitimate claim to the French throne, and he intended to pursue that claim with every resource at his disposal. Henry V is one of those historical figures who has been so heavily mythologized that it is difficult to separate the man from the legend. Shakespeare's play, Henry V, written nearly 2 centuries after Agincourt, created an image of Henry as the ideal warrior king, a man who could inspire his troops with soaring rhetoric, who fought alongside his common soldiers, who combined martial prowess with Christian virtue. The real Henry was more complex. He was undoubtedly brave and skilled in warfare. He was also ruthless, willing to execute prisoners, to order the massacre of garrisons that resisted too long, to use terror as a weapon. He was deeply religious, attending Mass multiple times a day, believing sincerely that God favored his cause. He was also politically astute, skilled at managing his nobles, at presenting himself as the champion of English honor, at wrapping his ambitions in the language of justice and divine right. Henry believed that he was the rightful king of France, and he was willing to stake everything on that belief. In 1414, he sent embassies to the French court, demanding not just the return of English territories that had been lost, but also his recognition as heir to the French throne and the hand of Princess Catherine, the daughter of Charles VI, in marriage. The French response was contemptuous. According to legend, the Dauphin, the French crown prince, sent Henry a gift of tennis balls, a mocking suggestion that Henry should occupy himself with games rather than affairs of state. Whether this actually happened is debatable. The story appears in later chronicles but not in contemporary sources, but it captures the French attitude. They did not take Henry seriously. He was a young king of a smaller, less wealthy kingdom, and they believed he was bluffing. They were wrong. Henry spent 1414 and early 1415 preparing for war with meticulous care. He assembled ships, commissioning new vessels and requisitioning merchantmen to create a fleet capable of transporting an army across the English Channel. He stockpiled weapons and provisions, arrows by the hundreds of thousands, bows, armor, siege equipment, barrels of salted meat and grain, everything an army would need for a major campaign. He raised money through Parliament, securing taxes to fund the expedition. And he assembled his army. The core of the force would be men-at-arms, heavily armoured soldiers who fought on horseback or on foot, including knights and nobles who were obligated by feudal duty to serve the king. But the striking arm of the army would be the archers, thousands of them, mostly common men who had been trained since childhood in the use of the longbow, and who could shoot with a speed and accuracy that made them the most lethal infantry in Europe. By August 1415, Henry was ready. His army, perhaps 10,000 to 12,000 men, boarded ships at Portsmouth and sailed for France. The destination was Harfleur, a port city at the mouth of the Seine River in Normandy. Henry's plan was straightforward. Take Harfleur, establishing a secure base and foothold in Normandy, then advance toward Paris, bringing the French to battle, defeating them and forcing them to accept his demands. It was an ambitious plan, and it started well. The English fleet crossed the Channel without incident and landed near Harfleur on August 13th. The siege of the town began immediately. The siege of Harfleur lasted 5 weeks, much longer than Henry had expected. The town was well fortified and stubbornly defended. The English had to deploy their siege artillery, huge cannon that fired stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds, battering the walls day after day. They dug mines, tunneling beneath the fortifications to plant explosives. They assaulted breaches in the walls, fighting vicious battles in narrow gaps where attackers and defenders met face to face with swords and axes. And all the while, the army suffered. Dysentery, that scourge of medieval armies, swept through the English camp. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of men fell ill, weakened by the foul water and unsanitary conditions that were inevitable when thousands of men camped in one place for weeks. Some died. Many more were too sick to continue the campaign. By the time Harfleur finally surrendered on September 22nd, Henry's army had shrunk significantly. He left a garrison of perhaps 1,200 men to hold the town, and many of the sick were sent back to England. The army that marched out of Harfleur in early October was perhaps 6,000 strong, maybe a bit more. It was smaller, weaker, and later in the year than Henry had planned. Henry faced a decision. The original plan of marching on Paris was now clearly impossible. His army was too small, the season too late. Winter was approaching, and campaigning in winter was nearly impossible in the medieval period. The sensible course would be to return to England, consolidate his gains, and prepare for another campaign the next year. But Henry did not choose the sensible course. He decided to march north to Calais, the English-held port on the coast. The march would take about 8 days under good conditions, following the coast road. From Calais, the army could safely return to England. It was a calculated risk. The march would demonstrate English strength, assert Henry's presence in France, and bring the army home without the humiliation of simply sailing back after a difficult siege. What Henry did not know, or perhaps chose to ignore, was that the French had been assembling their own army while he was besieging Harfleur, and they were now moving to intercept him. The march to Calais began on October the 8th. For the first few days, the English moved relatively quickly, but they soon encountered problems. The French had destroyed bridges over rivers to slow the English advance. Henry's army had to detour inland, searching for crossings, adding days to the journey. All the while, French scouts shadowed them, reporting their position to the main French army. Food began to run short. The soldiers were put on half rations, then quarter rations. They were marching through hostile territory, and the local population had either fled or hidden their supplies. The men grew weaker, morale began to fray, and then, on October 20th, as the English crossed the Somme River at a ford, they saw something that sent a chill through the entire army. Ahead of them, blocking the road to Calais, was the French army. Thousands upon thousands of men, banners flying, armor gleaming, deployed across the English line of march. The trap had closed. The French army that confronted Henry was formidable in both size and quality. Estimates of French numbers vary wildly, from 12,000 to as many as 36,000 in the most inflated accounts. But a reasonable modern estimate is somewhere between 12,000 and 20,000 fighting men. They outnumbered the English by at least 2 to 1, possibly 3 to 1. More importantly, the French army represented the concentrated military power of the French kingdom. Hundreds of nobles had gathered, eager for the glory of defeating the English. Among them were princes of the royal blood, dukes, counts, and barons, the cream of French chivalry. Charles d'Albret, the Constable of France, commanded the army. With him were the Dukes of Orléans, Bourbon, and Alençon. The counts of Eu, Richemont, and Vaudemont, and dozens of other great lords. These were men who had spent their lives training for war, who could afford the best armour and weapons, who led retinues of their own men-at-arms. They were confident, perhaps overconfident, that they would crush this small English army that had dared to invade their land. The two armies faced each other near the village of Agincourt on the evening of October 24th. They were close enough that the soldiers on each side could see the enemy camp, could hear the sounds of thousands of men preparing for battle, could smell the smoke of countless fires. But night was falling, and neither side wanted to fight in darkness. The battle would wait for morning. That night was miserable for everyone. The rain continued to fall, steady and cold. The men huddled under whatever shelter they could find, though most had none. The English were exhausted, hungry, soaked to the skin, and terrified. They knew they were outnumbered. They knew they had little chance of victory. Many men made their confessions to priests, preparing their souls for death. Some wrote letters or wills, leaving messages for loved ones they expected never to see again. The mood in the English camp was sombre, almost funereal. Across the field, the French were more boisterous. They diced and drank, confident of victory, perhaps already arguing about who would have the honour of capturing the English king, who would win the greatest ransoms, who would be remembered as the hero of the day. Henry, in the English camp, moved among his men. He spoke to them, encouraged them, reminded them that they were fighting for their king and for England. According to some accounts, he spoke of the righteousness of his cause, of how God would protect those who fought for justice. Whether his words were as eloquent as Shakespeare later made them, we cannot know. But Henry understood that his men needed hope, and he gave it to them as best he could. He also made practical preparations. He had his men sharpen stakes, 6-foot lengths of wood with pointed ends, that could be driven into the ground to create a palisade against cavalry. He positioned his archers carefully, spreading them along the line, making sure they had clear fields of fire. He placed his men-at-arms in the centre, forming a solid block of armoured soldiers, and then he waited for dawn. October 25th, 1415, dawned grey and wet. The rain had finally stopped, but the ground was a morass. The field between the two armies was perhaps 1,000 yards wide, narrowing to about 900 yards at the point where the two woods on either side came closest together. This narrow point is where the armies would clash. The English formed up first, taking position across the field with their backs to the woods behind them. The men-at-arms formed 3 divisions in the centre, with the archers deployed on the flanks and possibly also interspersed among the men-at-arms. The French, slower to organise because of their greater numbers and the fact that many nobles were jostling for position in the front ranks, eventually formed 3 divisions of their own. The first division, all mounted men-at-arms, would charge the English. The second division, also mounted or dismounted men-at-arms, would follow. The third division, a mix of cavalry and infantry including crossbowmen, would be the reserve. The French had thousands of men, but the narrow field meant that only a portion of them could fight at any given time. For hours, the two armies faced each other across the muddy field. Neither side moved. The French were waiting for the English to attack, expecting them to grow desperate and charge forward, where the French cavalry could destroy them. The English were waiting for the French to attack, hoping to fight from a defensive position, as they had at Crécy and Poitiers. Hours passed. The men stood in the mud, the tension mounting, the silence broken only by the occasional shout or the jingle of harness. Finally, around 11 in the morning, Henry decided he could not wait any longer. His men were growing colder and weaker standing in the mud. If the French would not attack, the English would have to move forward and provoke them. Henry gave the order to advance. The English army moved forward perhaps 200 to 300 yards, slowly, trying to maintain formation in the clinging mud. They stopped within longbow range of the French, about 250 to 300 yards, a distance where English bows could shoot effectively, but where the French crossbows had little chance of replying with accuracy. The archers drove their stakes into the ground, creating a makeshift defense against cavalry, and then they loosed their first volleys. Thousands of arrows, shot high into the air, arced over the French line and rained down on the packed ranks of cavalry and infantry. The bodkin point arrows, designed to pierce armour, found gaps in visors, joints in plate, vulnerable spots embarking on horses. Men and horses began to fall, and the French cavalry, their blood up, their pride stung by being shot at by commoners, surged forward without waiting for orders. The battle had begun. The French cavalry charge should have been devastating. Hundreds of armoured knights on powerful horses accelerating to a gallop, crashing into the English line with the force of a battering ram. This was how cavalry had dominated battlefields for centuries. But at Agincourt, the charge fell apart before it even reached the English. The mud was the first problem. Horses cannot gallop through deep, clinging mud. They struggle, they stumble, they slow to a laboured trot at best. The French knights, weighed down by their own armour, could do nothing to help their horses. Some horses simply stopped, refusing to go further. Others floundered, pitching their riders into the mud. Those that did make it closer to the English line found themselves running into a storm of arrows. The archers were shooting as fast as they could, and a good archer could loose 10 to 12 arrows a minute, maybe more. Thousands of archers, each shooting that fast, created a density of fire that was lethal. Horses were hit and went down, throwing their riders or rolling over them. Knights were hit and knocked from their saddles. The charge lost all cohesion and became a confused mass of struggling horses and dismounted men. Some French cavalry did reach the English line, but they found themselves impaled on the stakes the archers had planted, or driven off by archers wielding swords, axes, and mallets. Archery in the medieval period was not a safe job. Archers did not stand back and shoot from a distance, while others did the fighting. They were expected to defend themselves in close combat, and at Agincourt, many of them did exactly that, clubbing down knights who got too close. The French cavalry charge, which should have swept the English away, had instead been shattered. Riderless horses bolted, crashing into the French infantry that was now advancing on foot behind the cavalry, adding to the chaos. The second phase of the battle was the assault by the French men-at-arms on foot. Thousands of them, the cream of French nobility, dismounted from their horses and marched toward the English line. They were heavily armoured, wearing full-plate armour that weighed perhaps 50 to 60 pounds or more, and they were marching uphill through deep mud while carrying weapons and shields. It was exhausting work. Before they even reached the English, many were gasping for breath, overheating in their armour, struggling to keep formation. And all the while, the English archers continued shooting. Arrows could not easily penetrate the best plate armour, but they found joints, eye slits, and unarmoured spots. Men fell, and those behind had to climb over the bodies or step around them, further disrupting the advance. When the French men-at-arms finally reached the English line, the fighting became a savage melee. The English men-at-arms, also armoured but fighting from a stationary defensive position and thus less exhausted, met the French with pole axes, swords, and maces. At this range, in this kind of fight, skill and numbers mattered, but so did stamina and position. The English had the better position, fighting from firmer ground, while the French were packed so tightly together that they could barely swing their weapons. Men in the front ranks of the French line were pushed forward by those behind, crushed together, unable to retreat, even if they wanted to. The English line held, just barely, and the French push began to stall, and then the archers joined in. Having run out of arrows or finding themselves with no clear shot, the English archers grabbed whatever weapons they could find: hammers, axes, swords, even their bows used as clubs, and they waded into the flanks of the French formation. The French, armoured and exhausted, found themselves attacked from the sides by unarmoured or lightly armoured men who were fresher and more mobile. The archers targeted the French nobility specifically, not to kill them initially, but to drag them down into the mud and take them prisoner. A captured knight was worth a fortune in ransom, and the archers knew it. They pulled French nobles down, wrestled them into the mud, held them down until they yielded. This added to the confusion and panic in the French ranks. The French formation collapsed. Men at the front, unable to go forward, trapped by the press of bodies behind them, began to fall. Some were cut down, some simply fell from exhaustion and were trampled or suffocated by the weight of other men falling on top of them. The mud that had been an inconvenience became a death trap. Men in full armour, once down, could not easily get up. If another armoured body fell on top of them, they could be pinned, face down in the mud, unable to breathe, drowning in inches of muddy water. This is how many French nobles died at Agincourt, not from arrows or sword strokes, but from suffocation in the mud, crushed under the weight of their own comrades and their own expensive armour. The fighting was ferocious for perhaps an hour, maybe two. The French threw in their second division, but the result was the same. The narrow field, the mud, the English archers, and the solid English line combined to turn the French attack into a disaster. Bodies piled up in front of the English position. The English soldiers, exhausted now themselves, clung to their ground and kept fighting. And eventually, the French attack simply stopped. Those who could retreated, stumbling back through the mud toward their own lines. The field was left covered with the dead and dying, and with hundreds of prisoners, French nobles who had been captured and were now being held by English soldiers hoping to collect ransoms. Then came one of the most controversial moments of the battle. Henry, seeing the French 3rd Division still intact and apparently preparing to attack, and hearing reports that the French were also raiding the English baggage train at the rear of the army, made a terrible decision. He ordered the execution of the French prisoners. This was a shocking breach of the customs of chivalric warfare. Captured nobles were supposed to be held for ransom, not killed. But Henry was worried that if the French attacked again, the English would have to fight on two fronts, with armed prisoners potentially attacking from behind. So he gave the order. Many of the English soldiers, who saw the prisoners as valuable sources of wealth, refused to carry out the order. Henry assigned a group of archers to do it, and they obeyed. Hundreds, perhaps over 1,000 French prisoners were killed, most of them suffocated or had their throats cut. It was an atrocity, even by medieval standards, and it would stain Henry's reputation, though his apologists later argued it was a military necessity. In the event, the French 3rd Division did not attack. The French commanders, seeing the carnage in front of the English line, seeing their own nobility lying dead or captured, lost their nerve. The battle was over. By mid-afternoon, the English held the field. They had won a victory so complete, so unlikely, that it seemed miraculous. The French losses were staggering. Somewhere between 4,000 and 10,000 French soldiers died at Agincourt. The exact number is impossible to determine, but certainly thousands. Among the dead were the Constable of France, 3 dukes, at least 90 counts and barons, and over 1,500 knights. An entire generation of French nobility was wiped out in a single afternoon. The English losses, by contrast, were minimal. Perhaps 100 to 400 dead, most of them men at arms. Not a single English nobleman of significant rank was killed. The disparity in casualties is one of the most striking aspects of Agincourt. How did an outnumbered, exhausted, starving English army inflict such a devastating defeat on a larger, better equipped French force? The answer lies in a combination of factors. The terrain was critical. The narrow field negated the French numerical advantage, forcing them to attack on a front where only a portion of their army could fight at any time. The mud turned the field into a nightmare for heavily armoured men and horses, sapping their strength and mobility. The English longbow in the hands of skilled archers was a weapon of devastating power, capable of disrupting cavalry charges and inflicting casualties at a distance where the French had no effective reply. English tactical discipline, the ability to hold formation under pressure, allowed them to withstand the French assaults. And French overconfidence, the assumption that noble knights in expensive armour would easily defeat common archers and a smaller force, led them to attack recklessly without proper coordination. After the battle, the English stripped the dead of valuables, collected armour and weapons, and tended to their wounded. Henry stayed on the battlefield that night, securing his position, wary that the French might regroup and attack again. But the French army had disintegrated. The survivors fled in all directions. The English buried some of their own dead and left the French dead for local villagers to deal with. The next morning, October 26th, Henry led his army north toward Calais. They moved carefully, still expecting ambush or pursuit, but none came. They reached Calais without further incident and from there returned to England. Henry returned to England as a conquering hero. The news of Agincourt spread rapidly, and the English celebrated wildly. This was the greatest English military victory since Crécy, perhaps greater, because the odds had been so long and the result so complete. Henry entered London in triumph, and the city staged elaborate pageants and celebrations in his honour. He was compared to classical heroes, to Alexander and Caesar. The victory was seen as proof of God's favour, evidence that Henry's claim to France was just. Henry himself attributed the victory to divine intervention, and he ordered that all praise be given to God rather than to himself. Whether this was sincere humility or calculated propaganda, it worked. Henry's prestige was at its zenith, but Agincourt did not end the war. It was a single battle, a stunning victory to be sure, but it did not force France to surrender or accept Henry's demands. The French king, Charles VI, remained on his throne, though his mental illness meant he was essentially a figurehead. The Dauphin, the crown prince, took over leadership of the French resistance. France remained divided by civil strife, with the Armagnac and Burgundian factions fighting each other as much as they fought the English, but the kingdom did not collapse. Henry would have to return to France again and again to press his claim. Over the next 5 years, from 1417 to 1420, Henry conducted a methodical conquest of Normandy, taking town after town, castle after castle, until most of the region was under English control. In 1420, Henry achieved what seemed like the culmination of his ambitions. The Treaty of Troyes, signed in May of that year, recognized Henry as heir to the French throne. Charles VI, under pressure and possibly not fully understanding what he was agreeing to in his madness, accepted Henry as his son and heir, disinheriting his own son, the Dauphin. Henry also married Catherine of Valois, the French princess, cementing the union of the two crowns. The treaty stipulated that upon Charles's death, Henry would become king of both England and France, uniting the two kingdoms under one ruler. It seemed as if Henry had won everything he fought for. But fate is cruel. In 1422, just 2 years after the Treaty of Troyes, Henry V died. He was only 35 years old, cut down in his prime by dysentery, the same disease that had plagued his army at Harfleur 7 years earlier. He died in France, still campaigning, still trying to consolidate his conquests. 2 months later, Charles VI also died. Henry's infant son, less than a year old, was proclaimed King Henry VI of England and King Henry II of France. But an infant could not rule, and the moment of English triumph was already slipping away. The Dauphin, who had been disinherited by the Treaty of Troyes, refused to accept its terms. He declared himself King Charles VII and rallied the French resistance. Over the next decade, the war continued, and gradually, the English position eroded. In 1429, a peasant girl named Joan of Arc emerged, claiming to have visions from God telling her to drive the English out of France. She inspired the French to a series of victories, lifting the siege of Orléans and enabling Charles VII to be crowned at Reims. Though Joan herself was captured and burned at the stake by the English and their Burgundian allies in 1431, her impact on the French morale was lasting. The tide turned decisively. By 1453, the English had been driven out of nearly all of France, retaining only Calais. The 100 Years' War ended not with a treaty, but with a whimper, as the last English garrisons were overrun or simply abandoned. Agincourt, in the long run, changed nothing strategically. England did not conquer France. The English claim to the French throne was never accepted by the French people. Within 40 years of Agincourt, the English dream of a dual monarchy was dead. But Agincourt changed everything culturally and psychologically. It became the defining English military victory of the medieval period, the moment that proved English valour, English prowess, English divine favour. The longbow became a symbol of English identity, the weapon that allowed common Englishmen to defeat French knights, a democratisation of warfare that appealed to later English sensibilities. The battle featured prominently in English chronicles and histories, and by the time Shakespeare wrote his play in the late 1500s, it had become a foundational myth of English nationhood. Shakespeare's play, written for the Elizabethan stage, takes considerable liberties with history, but captures something essential about how Agincourt was remembered in England. The play's famous St. Crispin's Day speech, in which Henry rallies his men before the battle, with words about being a band of brothers and how those who fight this day will be remembered forever, is pure invention. There is no record of Henry giving such a speech, and the eloquent rhetoric is Shakespeare's, not Henry's. But the speech resonated with English audiences because it expressed what they believed about Agincourt, that it was a moment of national unity when king and commoner fought side by side, when courage and faith overcame overwhelming odds. The French, naturally, remembered Agincourt very differently. For them, it was a humiliating disaster, a day when the flower of French chivalry was cut down by common soldiers, when the pride of the kingdom was dragged into the mud and suffocated. French chronicles were more muted in their coverage of the battle than English ones, perhaps because the defeat was too painful to dwell upon. But Agincourt scarred the French national consciousness. It was remembered as proof that the old ways of warfare, the dominance of the armoured knight, were no longer sufficient. It was remembered as a symbol of French disunity, because the civil war between Armagnacs and Burgundians meant that not all French forces had been present at Agincourt, and those who were had fought without coordination or unified command. And it was remembered as a challenge that would eventually be answered, not at Agincourt itself, but through the slow, grinding reconquest of French territory over the next decades. The memory of the battle lived on in the landscape itself. The field of Agincourt, a place that had been unremarkable farmland, became a pilgrimage site, a place where people came to walk the ground where so many had died. The local villagers buried the dead in mass graves, and for years afterward, bones and pieces of armour would be turned up by ploughs. The woods that flanked the battlefield, the woods that had channeled the armies into that fatal narrow space, remained largely unchanged for centuries. Even today, visitors to the area can walk the field, can see the gentle slope up which the French charged, can imagine the mud and the rain and the terror of that October day. There is a museum now, and monuments marking key positions, and interpretive signs explaining what happened. But the field itself is still farmland, still ploughed and planted, still yielding crops as it did 600 years ago, indifferent to the human drama that once played out there. The battle also had lasting effects on military technology and tactics. Agincourt, along with Crécy and Poitiers before it, demonstrated the power of the longbow and the effectiveness of defensive tactics that combined archery with solid infantry formations. European armies took note, though the lessons were absorbed slowly and unevenly. The French eventually reformed their military, reducing the emphasis on heavy cavalry and developing more combined arms tactics that integrated infantry, artillery, and lighter cavalry. The longbow itself, ironically, had a relatively short period of dominance. By the late 15th century, firearms were becoming more common, and while early guns were slower and less accurate than longbows, they required less training to use effectively. A longbowman needed years of practice to develop the strength and skill to use the weapon properly. A musketeer could be trained in weeks. Economics and practicality eventually favoured the gun over the bow. And by the 16th century, English armies were using firearms alongside or instead of longbows. But the cultural memory of the longbow persisted long after the weapon itself had become obsolete. In England, the longbow was romanticised as the weapon of the common man, the yeoman archer who could stand against the armoured knight. Laws were passed requiring men to practice archery, even as these laws became increasingly irrelevant to actual military needs. The image of the English archer, loosing arrows with deadly precision, became part of the national mythology, linked inexorably to Agincourt. Even today, when people think of medieval English warfare, they often think of longbowmen, and that association is due primarily to Agincourt and the way it was remembered and celebrated. The battle also influenced ideas about chivalry and warfare. The medieval code of chivalry emphasized honor, courage, and the glory of combat between equals. Knights were supposed to fight other knights, and there were elaborate rules about ransoms, treatment of prisoners, and honorable conduct. Agincourt challenged this worldview in several ways. First, it showed that common archers could kill noble knights, which violated the social hierarchy that underpinned chivalric culture. Second, Henry's order to execute prisoners was a stark rejection of chivalric norms, prioritizing military necessity over honor. Third, the sheer carnage of the battle, the image of armored nobles suffocating in mud, was deeply unheroic and undignified, far from the idealized combat celebrated in chivalric literature. Agincourt did not destroy the concept of chivalry, which continued to influence European culture for centuries, but it exposed the gap between chivalric ideals and the brutal reality of warfare. One of the most striking aspects of Agincourt is how much of the battle came down to chance and circumstance. The rain that turned the field to mud was not planned by anyone. The narrow width of the field, determined by the position of two woods, was a geographic accident. The French decision to attack across that muddy field, rather than waiting for better conditions or maneuvering to find better ground, was a choice driven by pride and impatience rather than strategic calculation. The English decision to provoke the French into attacking by advancing within bowshot was a gamble that could have backfired badly. If the French cavalry charge had succeeded, if the French men-at-arms had broken through the English line, if the English archers had run out of arrows earlier, if any of a dozen small things had gone differently, the outcome could have been reversed. History is contingent, dependent on small decisions and random events, and Agincourt is a perfect example of this contingency. The personalities involved also shape the outcome in ways that go beyond tactics and terrain. Henry's determination to march to Calais rather than retreat to Harfleur after the siege, his willingness to risk battle against overwhelming odds, these decisions reflected his character, his sense of honor, and his belief in divine favor. A more cautious king might have made different choices and avoided the battle entirely. The French commander's decision to attack across the muddy field, rather than starving the English out, or maneuvering to force them onto better ground for the French reflected their own confidence, their contempt for the English, and perhaps their awareness that the longer they waited, the more likely English reinforcements or bad weather would complicate the situation. Both sides made choices based on incomplete information, cultural assumptions, and personal temperament, and those choices determined the fate of thousands. The common soldiers, whose names we do not know, and whose stories are mostly lost, experienced Agincourt very differently from the kings and nobles whose actions fill the chronicles. For an English archer standing in the mud on the morning of October 25th, the battle was not about dynastic claims or national glory. It was about survival. He was cold, wet, hungry, exhausted, and terrified. He could see the massive French army across the field, and he knew that if the French broke through, he would likely die. He shot his arrows because his commanders told him to, and because killing Frenchmen was the only way to save his own life. After the battle, if he survived, he might have looted bodies, looking for anything valuable that could be sold or ransomed. He might have felt relief at being alive, pride at having been part of a famous victory, or horror at the things he had seen and done. And then he would have marched to Calais and sailed home, back to his village, back to his ordinary life, carrying memories of the battle that would fade only slowly, if at all. For a French knight lying dead in the mud at Agincourt, the battle was the end of everything. He might have been in his 20s or 30s, from a noble family with estates in Normandy or Burgundy or the Loire. He would have trained since childhood to be a warrior, learning to ride, to fight with sword and lance, to bear the weight of armor. He would have been confident in his abilities, proud of his lineage, certain that fighting the English was his duty and his honor. He rode or marched onto the field expecting victory, expecting glory, expecting to capture English prisoners and win ransoms. Instead, he found mud and arrows and chaos. Perhaps he fell to an arrow that found the gap in his visor. Perhaps he was pulled down by English archers and held face down in the mud until he drowned. Perhaps he was crushed under the weight of other men falling on top of him. However he died, his death was almost certainly painful, terrifying, and ignoble. His body might have been stripped by looters, buried in a mass grave by villagers, or left to rot until someone came to collect it. His family would have learned of his death weeks or months later and mourned him as a hero who died fighting the English invader. These individual experiences, multiplied by thousands, are what Agincourt actually was beneath the grand narratives of kings and nations. It was thousands of personal tragedies and triumphs, moments of courage and terror, acts of mercy and cruelty, all compressed into a few hours on a muddy field in northern France. The battle shaped history, but it was experienced by individuals, and we should not lose sight of that human dimension, even as we marvel at the strategic and tactical aspects. The aftermath of the battle also had profound effects beyond the battlefield itself. The deaths of so many French nobles at Agincourt created power vacuums across France. Estates suddenly lacked heirs. Young boys inherited titles and lands they were not ready to manage. Widows and orphans faced uncertain futures. The French court was thrown into deeper turmoil as different factions maneuvered to fill the void left by the dead. This internal chaos made it easier for Henry to conduct his conquest of Normandy in the years after Agincourt, because France was too divided to mount an effective coordinated resistance. In England, the ransom of captured French nobles became a significant source of wealth for the soldiers who captured them and for the crown, which took a share of all ransoms. Some English soldiers became rich from the ransoms they collected at Agincourt. Others sold their rights to the ransoms to wealthy merchants or nobles who could afford to wait for the payments. The ransoming system was complex and legalistic, with detailed negotiations over amounts, payment schedules, and terms. Some French prisoners remained in English captivity for years, waiting for their families to raise the money to free them. Others were released on parole, their word of honor binding them to return to custody if the ransom was not paid. The whole system was an integral part of medieval warfare, an economic relationship that existed alongside the violence. Agincourt also had religious significance for both sides. Before the battle, Henry and his men prayed for divine favor, and after the victory, they attributed the outcome to God's will. Henry insisted that credit for the victory go to God, not to himself, and he ordered celebrations to be religious in nature rather than martial. The English saw Agincourt as proof that God supported Henry's claim to France, that their cause was righteous. Churches across England held Thanksgiving services, and Agincourt was commemorated in prayers and processions. The French, by contrast, struggled to understand why God had allowed such a disaster. Some French writers suggested that the defeat was divine punishment for French sins, for the civil wars and moral corruption that plagued the kingdom. Others simply lamented the loss without trying to find theological explanations. The battle has been studied by military historians for centuries as a case study in tactics, leadership, and the importance of terrain. Modern military academies still examine Agincourt when teaching about the use of terrain to offset numerical disadvantage, the importance of logistics and supply in military campaigns, and the psychological factors that affect combat effectiveness. The battle demonstrates that superior numbers do not guarantee victory if the smaller force has better position, better morale, and better use of its advantages. It also demonstrates the dangers of overconfidence and the importance of adapting tactics to conditions rather than rigidly following traditional approaches. Archaeologists and historians continue to study the battlefield, using modern technology to understand what happened. Metal detectors have found arrowheads, pieces of armor, and other artifacts scattered across the field. Soil analysis has confirmed the extent of the muddy conditions. Careful study of the terrain has allowed historians to reconstruct the positions of the armies and the likely sequence of events. While many details remain uncertain, we understand Agincourt better today than ever before, thanks to this combination of documentary evidence and physical archaeology. The battle has also entered popular culture in ways that go beyond Shakespeare's play. Novels, films, television series, and video games have all depicted Agincourt, each interpretation shaped by the concerns and interests of its own time. Some versions emphasize the heroism and glory of the battle. Others focus on its brutality and waste. Some see it as a triumph of English nationalism. Others view it as an example of the horrors of war. The battle is flexible enough to support multiple interpretations, which is part of why it continues to fascinate. The centenary and subsequent anniversaries of Agincourt have been marked by commemorations in both England and France. In 2015, the 600th anniversary was observed with academic conferences, reenactments, and ceremonies at the battlefield site. These events brought together historians, descendants of those who fought, and members of the public interested in medieval history. The commemorations were generally cooperative between English and French participants, acknowledging the historical significance of the battle, while also recognizing that modern nations should not be defined by medieval conflicts. There is a recognition that Agincourt is part of the shared history of both nations, a moment that shaped both, and that it should be remembered with respect for all who fought, regardless of which side they were on. The strategic situation that led to Agincourt, the 100 Years' War itself, was ultimately about competing visions of sovereignty and legitimacy. The English kings believed they had a rightful claim to France based on genealogy and precedent. The French believed that France should be ruled by Frenchmen, that the Valois dynasty was legitimate, and that English claims were a pretext for conquest. Neither side was entirely wrong or entirely right. The complexity of medieval feudalism, where a man could be both a king in his own right and a vassal to another king for certain territories, created situations that had no clear legal resolution. War became the arbiter, and Agincourt was one round in that long, bitter contest. Looking at the broader sweep of the 100 Years' War, Agincourt was a spectacular English victory that ultimately led nowhere. Despite Henry's conquests and the Treaty of Troy, despite his marriage to Catherine of Valois and the nominal union of the crowns, England lost the war. By 1453, France had expelled the English and reclaimed nearly all its territory. The effort to conquer France had cost England enormous amounts of blood and treasure, had drained the royal treasury, and had contributed to the political instability that would eventually erupt in the Wars of the Roses. France, despite the devastation it suffered, emerged from the war stronger and more unified, with a sense of national identity forged in the struggle against English invasion. The long-term winner of the 100 Years' War was clearly France, but you would not know that from the way Agincourt is remembered in England. This disconnect between the outcome of a battle and the outcome of a war is an important historical lesson. Winning battles does not always translate to winning wars. Strategic objectives, logistics, political cohesion, economic resources, all of these matter as much as or more than tactical brilliance on the battlefield. Henry V won at Agincourt, and he won other battles and sieges in the years that followed, but he could not consolidate his conquests, could not win the loyalty of the French people, could not solve the fundamental problem that he was trying to rule a foreign nation that did not want him as king. His early death cut short his plans, but it is not clear that those plans would have succeeded even if he had lived. The momentum was already shifting against England by the time Henry died. The technological aspects of Agincourt also deserve deeper consideration. The English longbow was a remarkable weapon, but it had limitations. It required enormous strength to use. Pulling a longbow with a draw weight of 100 pounds or more took years of training and physical development. English law mandated archery practice for commoners, requiring men to spend time regularly at the butts, shooting at targets, building the muscles and skills needed to use the weapon effectively in war. A longbowman had to practice from childhood to reach peak effectiveness. This training infrastructure was unique to England, and it gave the English a military advantage for about 2 centuries, from the early 1300s to the early 1500s. But it was also a fragile advantage, dependent on maintaining the training system and the supply of good quality bows and arrows. Once firearms became practical, the advantage evaporated because guns required much less training and were easier to supply and maintain. The armour worn at Agincourt represented the pinnacle of medieval metallurgy. Full plate armour, properly fitted, offered excellent protection against most weapons. A man in good plate armour was nearly invulnerable to sword cuts and could withstand arrows unless they hit weak points. But armour had disadvantages. It was expensive, making it accessible only to the wealthy. It was heavy, and while a fit man could move reasonably well in armour, it was exhausting to wear for extended periods, especially in combat. And it offered no protection against suffocation, which is how many men died at Agincourt, trapped under piles of bodies, unable to breathe. The image of knights as lumbering, immobile figures is largely a myth. Good armour allowed considerable freedom of movement, but at Agincourt, the conditions turned armour into a liability. The horses used in medieval warfare were also specialised animals, bred and trained for combat. A destrier, the type of horse a knight would ride into battle, was powerful, aggressive, and trained to bite and kick enemies. These horses were expensive and valuable, almost as much an investment as the armour. Losing a warhorse was a significant financial blow to a knight. At Agincourt, many of the French horses were killed or injured in the initial cavalry charge, and this loss contributed to the French defeat. The horses that did not die in the charge often panicked and stampeded back through the French lines. adding to the chaos. The logistics of medieval armies like those at Agincourt were challenging in ways that modern people sometimes underestimate. An army of 6,000 to 10,000 men, plus horses and camp followers, needed vast amounts of food, water, and supplies daily. They had no refrigeration, no canned goods, no easy way to preserve food for long periods. Everything had to be carried or found locally. When an army marched through an area, it often stripped the countryside bare, taking everything edible and leaving the local population to starve. This was not necessarily malicious, though it could be. It was simply the reality of feeding a large group of armed men far from home. The strain this placed on local populations was enormous, and it created resentment and resistance that complicated military operations. Disease was a constant companion of medieval armies, far more deadly than combat in most campaigns. Dysentery, typhus, typhoid fever, various respiratory infections, all of these thrived in the unsanitary conditions of military camps. Soldiers drank contaminated water, ate spoiled food, lived in close quarters that allowed diseases to spread rapidly. More men died of disease than of wounds in most medieval wars. Henry's army at Harfleur was decimated by dysentery, and the survivors who fought at Agincourt were already weakened by weeks of poor food and sickness. The fact that they won despite this physical disadvantage makes the victory even more remarkable. Communication in medieval armies was primitive by modern standards. Commanders could not radio or telephone their subordinates. They had to send messengers on horseback or on foot, and messages took time to deliver and could be intercepted or garbled. Orders could be misunderstood or ignored. Once a battle began, the commander's ability to adjust tactics was limited. He could send riders with new orders, but by the time those orders reached their destination, the situation might have changed completely. This meant that battles often devolved into chaotic melees, where small unit leaders made their own decisions based on what they could see immediately around them. The commander's role was more about setting the initial plan and inspiring the troops than about micromanaging the battle as it unfolded. Given all these constraints and challenges, the fact that medieval commanders could coordinate armies of thousands of men and achieve their objectives at all is impressive. Henry's march from Harfleur to Agincourt, Kara Mustafa's siege of Vienna, Leonidas's defense of Thermopylae, all of these operations required planning, logistics, and execution that were remarkable for their time. We should not judge medieval warfare by modern standards, but we can appreciate the ingenuity and adaptability of commanders who worked with the tools and knowledge available to them. Agincourt also highlights the role of contingency and luck in history. If the field had not been muddy, if the French cavalry charge had broken through, if Henry had been killed by an arrow, if the French 3rd Division had attacked instead of watching, the outcome could have been completely different. We remember Agincourt as a great English victory, but it could easily have been a catastrophic English defeat. The line between triumph and disaster was thin, and it hinged on factors that no one fully controlled. This should make us humble when we study history, recognizing that outcomes are not predetermined, that small changes in circumstances can lead to vastly different results. The cultural legacy of Agincourt is perhaps more significant than its military legacy. The battle became a foundational myth for English national identity, a story that English people told themselves about who they were and what they valued. The image of outnumbered English soldiers standing firm against a larger enemy, trusting in their king and their god, overcoming the odds through courage and skill. This narrative resonated through English culture for centuries. It was invoked during the Spanish Armada in 1588, during the Napoleonic Wars, during World War II when Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. Each generation found in Agincourt a story that spoke to their own struggles and hopes. This mythologizing of Agincourt is both inevitable and problematic. It is inevitable because humans need stories, need heroes, need moments of glory to inspire and unite them. Agincourt provides all of these, and it is natural that the English would celebrate it. But it is problematic because myths simplify and distort. The real Agincourt was more complicated, morally ambiguous, and contingent than the myth suggests. Henry was not simply a heroic warrior king. He was also a ruthless conqueror who ordered the execution of prisoners. The English archers were not just brave yeomen defending their homeland. They were also invaders in a foreign country, many of them motivated by the prospect of loot and ransom. The battle was a triumph of tactics and luck as much as of courage. Acknowledging these complications does not diminish Agincourt's significance, but it does give us a richer, more honest understanding of what happened and why it mattered. In the end, the Battle of Agincourt stands as one of history's most dramatic underdog victories, a moment when everything seemed lost for the English and yet they prevailed. It was a day when mud and rain and geography combined with English longbows and French overconfidence to produce an outcome that shocked Europe and changed the course of the 100 Years' War. It was a day when thousands died in the most horrific ways imaginable, suffocated in mud, trampled by horses, pierced by arrows. It was a day when kings and commoners, nobles and archers, all faced death together and responded with courage, with terror, with determination, with all the complexity of human emotion. And it was a day that entered into legend, retold and reimagined by each generation, a story that continues to captivate us 600 years later. The field at Agincourt is quiet now. The rain still falls in autumn, turning the ground soft and muddy. The woods still stand on either side, framing the field where thousands fought. Crops grow where men once died, and the bones of the fallen have long since crumbled into the earth. But the memory endures. The story of Agincourt lives on, in books and plays and films, in academic studies and popular retellings, in the imagination of anyone who has ever wondered what it would be like to stand on that field on that October morning, to face overwhelming odds, to fight for survival, to be part of a moment that would echo through history. That is the power of Agincourt. Not just that it happened, but that it continues to matter, continues to inspire, continues to teach us about courage, about war, about the strange contingencies of history, about what human beings are capable of when pushed to the very edge.